Hello. I'm grateful to be among so many people committed to the cause of ending the suffering that's caused by human trafficking in all its forms. There's so much experience and passion and wisdom here in this conference. Human trafficking is a large and complex problem that none of us can solve without each other. Although there are many important strategies already, the persistence of the problem, despite our best efforts over the last 20 years, indicates that there's a need to try new strategies. I'm Matthew Clark. I live in Sydney, Australia, and I work with the Freedom Keys Research Project, an independent project seeking to generate innovative strategies to address human trafficking and to test the effectiveness of those ideas through field studies. In this session, I'll be turning our attention to the perpetrators' side of human trafficking. I hope this will be challenging to all of you, but I know that speaking about perpetrators may be especially painful to those who have suffered abuse, exploitation and coercion personally, or have seen such suffering firsthand. Please know that I hold your personal experiences with deep respect and hope not to create any further trauma. But the thrust of my talk is that if we want such abuses, exploitation and coercion to end, then we must think more deliberately about the behaviours and motivations of perpetrators and how to change those behaviours. I'm going to split this presentation into two sections, so I'll start with round one where I set the scene with certain terminology that I need to use, and then we'll have a Q&A session to make sure that we're all on the same page, and then in round two I'll get on to my main thesis, and then at the end have another Q&A session. Now, the core logic of my approach is this. To end human trafficking, we must change the behaviours of the peoples who exploit, abuse and coerce others for their own gain. There is no other way. The question is, how do we achieve that? To change their behaviour, we must first understand why they behave as they do. Only then can we design interventions that will effectively avert, deter, block, subvert or redirect the perpetrators to prevent the abuses, exploitation and coercion. However, in our global survey I led in 2020, asking anti-trafficking organisations about their strategic planning processes, I found that only 26% of those organisations include any role for perpetrators in their documented theory of change. I'm talking here at the conceptual level that applies to all the varied forms of human trafficking, to forced marriage, to state-sponsored labour exploitation, to the so-called sex trafficking, conscription into child armies, and the majority of the human trafficking cases, which are the various forms of labour exploitation. I know that there's debate about the meaning of the labels human trafficking and modern slavery, and I tend to avoid both labels and instead talk about the underlying relational elements common to all those forms, i.e. the way that some people abuse, exploit and coerce other people. I use the term perpetrator, and first of all I want to point out that a perpetrator is a person with moral agency. They're people who perpetrate a variety of abuses, exploitation and coercion. The label perpetrator does not identify the person completely, just as the terms victim and survivor do not define a person completely. The perpetrator refers to slaveholders and human traffickers primarily, but also to any individual directly or indirectly benefiting from the enslavement of another. So it includes the people who directly abuse, exploit and coerce other people, as well as people who generate the demand for goods and services produced by those who are being abused, exploited and coerced. In all those varied forms of human trafficking, we know far too little about the people who perpetrate the problem. What's their demographics? What are their age? What's their socio-economic background? What's the recidivism rates for people who are punished in jail and then leave? What are their motivations? Is it greed, social status, culture, family business? Were they previously victims themselves? Are they just living in survival? Well, before we get to the core ideas of this presentation, there's one more term that I need to define, and that's the concept of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a universal part of human experience. Even before birth, we are dependent on resources over which we have no control. We are fragile beings, vulnerable to disease, to broken bones, to emotional loss. Yet choosing to be vulnerable can be the greatest source of personal growth. Acknowledging our weaknesses, our fears, our shame can also be a great inspiration to others. And so vulnerability, confusingly, has both positive and negative connotations. In the 1940s, Abraham Maslow proposed this hierarchy of needs, and part of Maslow's idea is that the lower level needs must be met before a person can even consider the importance or value of satisfying higher level needs. When needs are not met, people become more vulnerable. This idea of forced vulnerability is far removed from that chosen vulnerability that may serve us well when we sit comfortably at one of the higher levels. If someone does not have access to food, water, warmth, rest, they cannot survive. They'll do whatever is necessary to meet those needs without concern for their safety or concern about friendships, loyalty or laws. People seeking only to survive are fundamentally disempowered in relation to other people who have the resources needed to survive. Such people are vulnerable to anyone who may compete with them for the available food, warmth, etc. They're also vulnerable to people who might provide or promise to provide food, water, warmth for them with strings attached, or in exchange for something that the person struggling to survive can hardly imagine. People who have those physiological needs met may start thinking about the need for safety, for protection from physical attack, for a source of income that allows them to stop worrying about the lower physiological needs. But even in that state, able to survive but physically and psychologically unsafe, they are vulnerable to those who could violate their safety and to those who may be able to provide safety for them at a cost. Now, no doubt there are limitations and flaws in Maslow's model, but this idea is clear. Vulnerability correlates with need. When someone is in need, regardless of what that need is, they are vulnerable to those who might keep the necessary resources from them, as well as to those who might offer the necessary resources at a cost. Now, secondly, the global slavery includes a description of country-level vulnerability. In fact, the Global Slavery Index, which is our best estimate of the prevalence of slavery globally, includes three core measurements: the prevalence of modern slavery in each country, the vulnerability of each country, which is a risk score based on 23 variables that seek to explain or predict that prevalence, and thirdly, the quality of government responses to modern slavery. Now, the 23 risk factors in their vulnerability model are grouped into 5 dimensions, which you can see on this slide. And the vulnerability score can be interpreted this way. If a country has inadequate governance of issues such as weapons and political rights, and if that country has a lack of meeting basic needs for many of its population, and significant inequalities exist between those who have access to wealth, who's affected by crime and who has access to law, and if that country has significant groups of disenfranchised people and significant internal conflict, terrorism, displacement, then it will have a high vulnerability score, which indicates the likelihood of a high prevalence of modern slavery in that country. To some extent, the factors that contribute to the vulnerability score are only correlated to modern slavery. That is, high vulnerability scores and high prevalence of modern slavery seem to go along with each other. When you see one, you see the other. But the Global Slavery Index also believes that these 23 factors help to explain the presence of modern slavery. That is, things like internal conflicts, inequality, lack of access to healthcare, political instability, etc., are what cause a country to have a high rate of modern slavery. In other words, that these 23 factors create vulnerability. Lastly, I want to say a few words about the vulnerability to being abused, exploited and coerced. The concept of vulnerability is well studied in relation to the victims and survivors of human trafficking at the individual level. What makes people vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced? Well, the list of factors is fairly well documented, and you're probably aware of most of these. People in poverty become more vulnerable to becoming victims. People's age and gender have a significant impact. Limited economic and educational opportunities. Marginalisation and discrimination. People who are runaway youth. People who are in detention centres. People who are undertaking irregular migration paths. People who are being displaced from their country, who suffer from substance abuse, or they're survivors of past abuse being applied to them. And of course there are other factors. But these are the types of things that we already recognise make a vulnerable population of people who are then easy to manipulate and exploit. Well, that brings me to the end of part 1, and we're going to pause the video now and have a Q&A time. And during that time you can ask some questions to clarify the things I've already said, but I want you to consider these 2 questions during that time as well. What's your response to my relabeling of human trafficking as abuse, exploitation and coercion? And secondly, I'd love to hear from you about whether your work already involves reducing the vulnerability to people becoming victims of human trafficking. We'll pause the video here. Well, I've claimed that unless we understand and engage with the perpetrators of human trafficking, the problem cannot be ended. And now that I've laid a foundation for understanding my terms, abuse, exploitation, coercion, perpetrator and vulnerability, we can turn to the question, what makes people vulnerable to becoming a perpetrator? We need to understand this if we wish to reduce that vulnerability. Some people become perpetrators while others do not. What makes the difference? Perhaps a common assumption is that some people are just evil. Another assumption may be that the core driver is greed. I believe the reality is more complex and nuanced, and that the whole range of factors that make people vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced also apply to the vulnerability of people becoming abusive, exploitative and coercive. Let me say that again. The same range of factors that make people vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced apply to the people who might become abusive, exploitative and coercive. A complex set of factors contribute to making a person vulnerable to abusing, exploiting and coercing others, and together these varied and interacting factors form a sort of ecology, a motivational ecology. Some of those factors are internal and psychological, and other factors are external and situational. As with any ecology, all these elements interact in complex ways, reinforcing each other, forming a system that can be difficult to disrupt. If we understand what makes people vulnerable to becoming a perpetrator, then we can turn to the next question. How might we try to reduce that vulnerability? Firstly, we could decrease the external contributing factors in the motivational ecology, and secondly, we could increase a person's internal resources, increasing their resilience so that the person is not under the control of those negative external factors. So let's look more closely at the likely external elements in the motivational ecology and then the likely internal elements. Now, I must be clear that there has been so little study of this topic that the specifics in the next few slides are speculative. They seem reasonable to me and to others I've discussed them with, but have not arisen from empirical studies. When we think of the type of interventions that might address the external factors that make someone vulnerable to becoming a perpetrator, I think it's likely that they are the same systemic interventions that we already use for victims and survivors. That is, poverty reduction, cultural change that affirms the dignity and rights of all, special consideration for people on the margins of social care, providing safe migration routes, reducing political conflict, providing access to basic needs like housing and food security, providing meaningful employment and other money-generating opportunities. Interventions that reduce those factors will reduce how easily people can be taken advantage of, but they will also reduce the need for people whose own survival drives them to take advantage of others. Secondly, the flow-on effects from addressing the country-level factors that we saw earlier. If we can address the governance issues, the lack of basic needs in some countries, the sense of inequality, groups of disenfranchised people, the effects of conflict, these factors are powerful external drivers that create opportunities for abuse. Remove those factors and people will be less tempted or able to exploit others. Thirdly, we need to do something that reverses the balance of the high return, low risk so that it becomes a low return, high risk enterprise. Now, like all of us, criminals do not act completely rationally, but nevertheless, consciously or unconsciously, they weigh up costs and benefits. If the benefits are not attractive enough, the money, the social status, etc., well, we won't bother trying. And if the costs are high financially, or the risk of social stigma, or the risk of legal punishment, we are also less likely to act. So let's think about ways that we can reduce the expectation of return. For example, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery earlier had an intention which was stated as to make slavery unprofitable. Now that's a worthwhile intervention in cases where profit is the motive, although that does not apply to all forms of human trafficking. In cases where the return is social status, then cultural change can make a difference. So suppose you live in a culture where giving your daughter to marry a richer, older man results in your own family gaining social status and influence. Well, then the likelihood that you will do that would reduce if the surrounding cultural acceptance of forced marriage was changed. If community pressure supporting forced marriage became community pressure that emphasized the value of young women and their autonomy, then the so-called reward of increased social status would be reduced and people would be less likely to do it. What about increasing the perceived risk or the cost? We could strengthen laws and law enforcement to increase the threat of punishment, and I'd say that in the last 20 years that's one of the anti-trafficking movement's primary approaches. There's little evidence that this deterrence assumption has actually worked, except perhaps if people perceive that the likelihood of being caught was very high. We could alternately increase the cost of operating a human trafficking business, what social movement theorists call the disruption costs. For example, collective action by unions and other worker-based organisations about fair pay and safe conditions. Or we could make it difficult to supply products unless you have some certification about fair employment conditions. Suppose McDonald's decided to renew their contracts for the supply of coffee beans not based on the lowest price, but giving preference to suppliers who could convincingly show that they were free of labour exploitation. Other job prospects or money-making opportunities would be helpful interventions as well, which change the external dynamics. People would be less likely to abuse, exploit and coerce if they had other options, other ways of making money, other ways of gaining a sense of control in their own lives, other ways of gaining social status. That's especially true for those who are themselves in vulnerable positions where they are just trying to survive. If we look at internal factors and the types of interventions that we might apply to change the internal aspects of the motivational ecology, one of the first things is to develop people's knowledge. Education in general is likely to reduce the likelihood that someone turns to human trafficking as a career choice. But education specifically about human trafficking can also make a difference. For instance, education about laws and the threat of punishment. In some studies that I've seen, people who have been convicted of human trafficking offences were not familiar or were unaware that what they were doing was actually illegal and surprised at the severity of the punishment. If people are unaware of the law or of the type of punishment that they might incur, then those laws, however strong they might be, cannot act as deterrents. Secondly, we might try to develop people's empathy. What has happened to them that they do not care about the suffering of another? Do they not know that they are abusing, exploiting and coercing other people? Then what type of intervention might teach them about the consequences of their action? Or is it that they know but they don't care? Well, then they will need psychological help to improve their empathy for others. Early values formation is an important factor. What kind of person do you want to be when you grow up? Can we get that message across to people at a young age? Do you want to become a protector or a predator when you grow up? A life in which you flourish does not have to be at the expense of someone else. We can all flourish together. Can we get those values across at an early age? I want to give a couple of examples of possible interventions, starting with this idea about early values formation. How do we already prepare children to understand and resist being taken advantage of? Do you run programs already doing this, that raise awareness of possible problems, that role play situations and options, perhaps using cartoons or role plays, developing people's agency to tell them that they have choices, letting them know who safe people are that they can talk to, and that it's best to keep no secrets that might lead to shame? Well, all of that can be applied to perpetrator vulnerability in the same way or in a parallel way that it's applied to victim vulnerability. If you have a room of people vulnerable to being exploited, there will be people in that same group who are vulnerable to becoming an exploiter. If you have any programs that seek to reduce vulnerability, please consider how those very programs might apply to potential perpetrators as well. As a second example, let's think about what conversation one might have with sex buyers. That is, to people who are creating the demand for coerced sex. The first thing to think about is, what attitude do we bring to the table ourselves? How would we approach the conversation with compassion rather than disgust, with humility, perhaps even as peers? Can we be listening rather than preaching so that people feel safe and heard and valued? I think unless we do some of those things, then we won't gain an audience at all. Secondly, we could think about, what are the sex buyers' motives and how do we challenge them? Do they know the motivations of the sex worker? We could ask them, what are they really looking for? It's unlikely that they're trying to hurt, but we should be emphasizing that true consent cannot be bought. We need to get past their common rationalizations. Well, I'm not hurting them, they might say. They look happy. If I didn't pay them, they'd be unemployed and even worse off. We could share actual stories from our own experience to challenge those inner rationalizations. And then we can do things which encourage change. We can ask the sex buyer, is this really the man you want to be? We can be shifting their heart rather than just their behaviour, arousing or developing empathy. We also need to be talking to them about where they can get further help, so that the ones who wish to change have support for that change. There's a variety of online groups that talk about the reality of prostitution and pornography. there are sexaholic support groups that you are probably aware of. If you want to develop a program in this space, there are resources available from groups like Exodus Cry, the MST Project, Flint in the UK, and people like Christian Lenti and Glenn Miles. So let me say once more, and again as kindly but as firmly as I can, the reason this discussion is so important is that we cannot expect to end or even reduce human trafficking unless we change the behaviours of perpetrators. I'm not suggesting that other types of intervention are unimportant. I'm not saying that simply focusing on perpetrator behaviour is all we need to do and the problem will go away. I'm certainly not suggesting that we go softly on the perpetrators and let them get away with their abuse. But if all your organisation does is rescue survivors and attempt to reintegrate them, then you are actually complicit in the system and causing the abuse of new victims. If all your organisation does is strengthen law enforcement so that the people who perpetrate abuse, exploitation and coercion are put in prison, without trying to change their hearts while they are in prison, then you are complicit in a retributive system that fails to fix anything. Now, I hope that this has been a disruptive presentation. As a movement, the anti-trafficking workers and organisations addressing human trafficking need to be more self-critical. We cannot keep repeating strategies that have failed to change the system of exploitation that underlies human trafficking. My hope is that together we will augment the current strategies by developing effective perpetrator-centric interventions, recognising that if we leave the perpetrator out of our theory of change, any successes cannot be more than localised and short-lived. Please contact me via this email address if you'd like to partner with us in this, or if you're already working in this direction. See our website for more information about the Freedom Keys Research Project, our published research, and videos of past presentations on YouTube.